This is Prep Talk. I'm Chris Park with my co-host Marvin Hammerschmidt. We have on the telephone this afternoon Erick Olsen. He's the Hermiston Bulldogs football radio play-by-play announcer in Hermiston. Erick, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today on Prep Talk and discuss some high school football this afternoon.
Absolutely, guys. Good to be here.
First off, let's review your background for our listeners. You work in radio at, is it KQFM in Hermiston?
KQFM and KOHU. I'm the news and sports director here into my 7th season as the voice of Bulldog athletics. Call football, basketball, softball, and baseball here.
Great.
And work for the OSAA during the playoffs, and I've done state championships for just about every sport that they hand out a blue trophy for.
Okay, so you got your start in radio and announcing, I believe, in the Portland area at Lake Oswego, LO, as everybody refers to that. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Actually, I was talking about that earlier today with the guy I started with, John Strong, who's the voice of the MLS Game of the Week for NBC. John and I were seniors in 2002, and we started broadcasting, Laker broadcasting. Actually, we founded that Lake Oswego High School broadcast program, and that first year went all the way to the state championship game when Sheldon and Alex Brink beat Lake Oswego in the 4A title game at the time.
Right, excellent. There's a connection with our show last week. For some of our listeners, we had on Gary Haliski, who's kind of a historian of the Midwestern League, a football and baseball guy, goes to local games, takes photos. Alex Brink is actually his stepson. Is that right, Marvin? Gary's stepson. So what a connection that is.
Well, and yeah, Alex was the best player on the field in a game that had about 4 D1 guys between the two teams in that state championship game back then. And then I actually did a stint down in that area. I was a U of O student along with John Strong for 4 years, and we actually did some campus radio down there for 3 years and did on GoDucks.com volleyball and softball for the University of Oregon from 2003 to 2007.
Wow,
Okay.
Didn't know that.
So tell me, Erick, do you find, we're mostly interested in football here. Marvin's having a hard time already because he heard volleyball and softball. But let me ask you, do you find that announcing other sports helps you in announcing football in any way? Is there any way that kind of helps you out?
Yeah, it's going to be weird, but the baseball and the softball are really good, and that's not going to sound like it's a normal comparison, but if you think about football, it's really 8-second bouts of action with 30 or 45 seconds in between sometimes. And so that idea of being able to fill and tell story just like you do in baseball and softball, which is considered, kind of exactly what that type of broadcasting is, that's one of the comparatives. And then once a play gets going, obviously the speed of a play and being able to describe it well is very similar to trying to do a good job of describing the action and painting a picture on a basketball court.
Well, I could just about imagine that there's a lot of time in baseball and softball for a lot of stories.
Yeah, and, the reality is that it happens, too, on the gridiron because, whether it's not so much with Hermiston because they are playing a tempo offense, but with other teams, if you're huddling up, you could have that 15, 20 seconds where there's time to fill, time to insert nuggets of information that you get through the week. So it's definitely important to be able to, for me, to be able to do all of them and kind of have a really broad base to work from.
Yeah, that's great. So, speaking of that, we're in week 6 now of the season. Hermiston is ranked 5 in the latest Oregon Live poll. They're 4-1 on the season. The only loss is 63-9 home loss to Sherwood. So, in your assessment, how's the season going this year so far for the Bulldogs?
It is going as expected, to be honest. It was good to see them pick up a couple of the wins they've got on the board. I think, just like everybody, they're hoping to be more competitive with Sherwood, but once you get the Bowman on the field and you see them, you kind of realize what the reality is this year in 5A football. Their offense has been very good. It's been prolific. It's between a really good balance of passing with Chase Canute's throwing to, at most games, 5, 6, 7 different guys, and the four-headed, now that everybody's healthy, running attack. They feel like they've got some really good balance, and they're still leaving points on the board. And defensively is the area where they still need to improve, and that's the area where they've got less experience for sure.
All right. Well, tell me a little bit about this, Eric. Hermiston, they made a trip to Hillsborough earlier in the year in week 2, and Marvin and I were talking about that the other day in preparation for this interview, that was perhaps symbolic for Hermiston, because they drove right by Hillsborough Stadium, the upcoming 5A championship game site, and maybe they'll get their way back there, again. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about another long road trip, specifically this week, Springfield High School, second long road trip for Hermiston? Really long question here, but can you give us a little preview of the upcoming Springfield Hermiston game?
Well, it's going to be an interesting test, and the road trip aspect isn't as big of a deal just because Hermiston is geographically isolated out here on an island. They're in the same league as Pendleton for how much longer is kind of up for debate because of the size discrepancy, but Hermiston's used to traveling. Their program has a really good support base through their linebacking club, so when they go on the road, they've got a family who's going to meet them an hour out or somewhere nearby. I think for this trip, it's going to be in the Eugene area, and they're going to have dinner at about 3 o'clock, and that's going to be taken care of for them. So they're used to traveling. That aspect doesn't necessarily throw them off, or at least it shouldn't throw them off. What would be interesting with Springfield, and I think what they're looking forward to as far as the challenge goes, is the same challenge that everybody faces when they get into this game with Springfield, is the competition that the Millers do present. And the thing that Hermiston has dealt with and at times had trouble with this year has been the mobile quarterback, and there might not be anybody better at that than Trevor Watson, and Trevor's probably going to be the best mobile quarterback Hermiston's seen. Last week it was Chase Schroll in the Dows. He has a 3-year starter next to his name, but not the same caliber of athlete as Watson. Drew Melton, the quarterback 2 weeks ago for Lewiston, was a good comparative to Watson, but containing him defensively is going to be one of those big keys. And then at the same time, what can you do with those athletes, or whether it's Taylor Travis or whether it's Jordan or it's Brandon Haas. So you've got guys in Springfield that definitely catch the attention of Hermiston, and they'll be a good test because the defense has been the question that is trying to be answered over the last few weeks.
Yeah, great. That's some great insight, Eric. This is your Prep Talk on LaneCountySportsOnline.com. We're talking with Erick Olsen, the Hermiston Bulldogs football radio play-by-play announcer. And speaking of travel commitments, can you talk a little bit about what a school like Hermiston goes through, being situated in Eastern Oregon and dealing with that every year? Are there any special procedures the coaching staff or team will use, such as staying overnight, organizing meals for such a long trip, etc.?
Well, like I said, the linebacking club will do the organization for meals, but other than that, they try to treat it as much as you possibly can like it's just everyday activity when you go on the road. And they know that their road trips are going to involve a stop somewhere at a gas station or a rest stop or whatever, and their road trips are going to be a few hours long. There's nothing necessarily in particular they do in the off-season or in the preseason to get ready for that, just because it's been a way of life since these kids were little kids and watching their brothers do this. And, it's been in every sport. It's only been the last 6, 7 years that the travel hasn't been quite as tough. I guess even less than that. The last 4 years, the travel hasn't been quite as tough not being in the IMC.
Do you guys have to travel with the team, or do you travel on your own?
Kind of depends on the situation. This week we travel on our own. because of a commitment at the Oregon Association of Broadcasters convention on Saturday up in at Skamania Lodge. But sometimes we'll travel with the team. Just kind of depends on the week.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Eric. You're listening to Prep Talk on LaneCountySportsOnline.com. Eric, I'd like you to give us your top 5 teams in Lane County, regardless of classification. Now, I'm going to give you a little time to think about that here, so as I fill in for you. Top 5 teams in Lane County, regardless of classification. I realize that you haven't seen all the teams play, but since this is LaneCountySportsOnline.com, can you maybe give us your top 5 here in Lane County? Sorry that Hermiston won't make that top 10, though.
Top 5 in Lane County.
Yeah.
And am I looking for based on how I expect them to finish?
Just the current top 5. And Hermiston doesn't count, even though they'll technically be in Lane County Friday night. You can't use them.
Well, to me, then, it comes down to, for number 1, it would be hard for me to count backwards. I think Sheldon, because their history just barely edges Lowell, because I expect Lowell to do some pretty spectacular things in the 1A playoffs this year.
Yep, I agree with both of those.
And then, Sheldon is Sheldon.
Yeah.
And then Springfield comes in right after that at number 3. There's a ton of respect for this Springfield team up here in Hermiston. And it was interesting. Earlier today, actually, I was talking with Dave Heiberger, and he said kind of the same thing. He's not sure how much people really are aware of Hermiston down there, but they're going to be in for a treat when they do get that opportunity to see that Hermiston team. So that would be 1, 2, and 3, and then after that, you've got me really trying to think here as far as either Eugene and surrounding area schools. In football,
well, I'll give you a moment to think about that, but I would agree with those. Lowell's really good for a 1A school. They're averaging about 100 and some points, Marvin. More seriously, 80, I think.
They're wearing out the light bulbs on the scoreboard for sure.
And Sheldon.
What impressed me about Lowell, I got the opportunity to do their semifinal game last year at Willamette University in Salem, and the kind of the resurgence of that program through making sure that you could get, the wrestling kids and the basketball kids back out together on the field. And when you put that many athletes together in 1A, it makes it really tough after that.
Yeah.
So, I think that's what jumps out about them. And that's kind of why, obviously you never see Sheldon and Lowell in the same breath. But I think when you talk about what they're going to do at the end of the year, I do think that Sheldon is a team that is right there in that Final Four of 6A at the end of the year because of their experience once they get into the postseason.
Well, we cover all teams in Lane County, 1A to 6A, and we're always giving attention to all of them. And if you're a football fan, you would like 1A football and Lowell. Let me go ahead and on to the next question, Eric. Your top 3 teams in the state, regardless of classification, and probably you could have 3 6A teams, but what are your top 3 teams in the state? I don't know, maybe you'll have a 5A team in that top 3.
I've got a 5A team in the top 3, but they're not number 1. I do believe that Sherwood's in that mix. I think that they're hands down the best 5A team, and the reality about 5A football this year is they would have to have a bad night, and you'd have to play your best game of the year. And it can happen because they play the type of preseason they do, and they see teams who they'll see in the postseason later on. And that's the type of team that has beaten Sherwood over their run over the last 5-6 years. It's the team that sees them twice in a season. Mountain View a couple of years in the state title game after Sherwood put it on Mountain View in the regular season.
Right.
It was Jefferson way back in the semifinals, the year Colt Laierla, the Duck tight end, and Hillsborough won their state title at the 5A level. Jefferson got pounded by Sherwood in the preseason and then came back and beat them in the semifinals. That's the type of team, because you just get familiarity against Sherwood's wing T. They do the same stuff. They're not going to put new stuff in for a game. Greg Lawrence says, we do what we do, and we do it perfect. At least that's the goal. So you know what their scheme is, and when you've seen it more often, that's the type of team that has a chance, and then you've usually got to have some D1 guys on your defense, and that was what Mountain View, and that's what Jefferson had. And, Marist has played a couple of just out-of-this-world games against them in the postseason over the last few years. That title game that went into overtime a few years back stands out as one of them, where, they also had that familiarity, so they came close. So this year, a West Albany team, I know Hermiston, even though it got pounded by them, they'd like to see him again. At least the coaches would definitely like to get another chance at him. But Sherwood's, to me, the number 3 team. After that, number 2, I think it's Tigers this year. I think that when you look at what the Tigers are doing offensively, they're putting up huge numbers. And then defensively, they're giving up, 5 points a game. That's a really, really tough team. And then that leaves at number 1, Central Catholic.
That's a good top 3. Can't disagree with that at all.
Yep, that's a solid top 3. So
interesting thing this year is, normally I wouldn't have Sherwood in the top 3 in the state. I think there is a difference in the 5A and the 6A, and I know the Sherwood people would disagree with me. I know Marist people would disagree when they look at some of the teams they've had. But this year, it seems like 6A has so much more parity than it's had, and I think it's a year where those elite teams aren't quite as elite. The Sheldon Lake Oswego duo that were in the state title game last year at the 6A level both graduated so many key people, and they always graduate a lot of guys, but this year it was just so dramatic how much younger they are than the year before.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good stuff. But hey, we got it's time for a serious questions now. Are you ready?
Do what we can. Absolutely. Right. Let's go.
Can you share with us some of your high school stadiums that you've been to that you thought were great venues for a football game? In other words, do you have a few favorites?
Well, I have to. I'm almost contractually obligated as I sit in Kennison Field at Bulldog Stadium watching the Hermiston boys soccer team play the Dowls right now. This stadium just opened this year after a redo that took the last year. Between grants and about $2 million worth of community in-kind donations, this is about a $5 million facility, 2,200 seats. It's the nicest press box I will work in. And, it's not just that it's got the field turf and the track is of the same caliber. I know this is going to be tough to say in Track Town, but it's of the same caliber, quality surface that they have at Hayward.
Great.
So, the track itself is out of this world, and kind of the track facility is. So, this is it. But after that, I enjoy Aaron Contreras Stadium at Sherwood. I think that's a nice setting.
Yeah, I agree. That's a nice one. Yep.
Oregon City also has a really nice facility to work from. It's got a really cool feel to it, just down in the bowl. And both sides, your fans have really lots of opportunities to get a good view of things. So that's another one that jumps out to me. It's been 2005 was the last time I did a game at Silky. I know that Silky's kind of a fun place to work from. And, I'm looking forward to getting back there Friday night for sure.
Yeah, Silky's got that old school feel to it. It's grass.
Actually, now that you mention that, the other old school one that really jumps out to me, West Albany's stadium is really fun in that old school kind of way.
Yeah, I agree. It's got kind of a unique grandstand on that one side. You ever had a chance, we're not talking Lane County or Oregon here, ever seen a game up in Tacoma, Washington at Stadium High School?
No, I haven't. We've done some Washington stuff in the Tri-Cities area and Yakima Valley, but nothing over on the west side yet for me.
Well, this is Prep Talk on LaneCountySportsOnline.com. I'm Chris Park with my co-host Marvin Hammerschmidt. We're talking with Erick Olsen. He's the voice of the Hermiston Bulldogs. Just a few more questions for you, Erick. Along the lines of great stadiums, concessions are very important to Marvin and I when we go to games. Any schools or stadiums that stand out for having really good concessions? Because that's always a real important topic for us.
Here you've got the Hermiston FFA program, which is the largest FFA program for a single school in the state. And they do a pork loin dinner every home game that's really spectacular. That's the homer pick, obviously. In Hood River, they do a really good barbecue pulled pork sandwich that you love every time halftime comes and they bring it up into the booth. So those are the two that jump out at me immediately.
Excellent.
That sounds really good. So, time to get serious once again. Let's talk about the upcoming OSAA reclassification and realignment. Eric, do you favor a 6-class system, or do you prefer a 5-class system for football?
I am going to hedge. I prefer a 5-classification system. I spent quite a bit of time when I was writing columns in this area working on what I would see as a 5-classification system, because with it, it's not just simply you take the low end 6A teams and the top end 4A teams and you put those 3 classifications together into 2. You have to make adjustments all the way 2A through 6A to make those final 4 classifications. You can't mess with 1A too much because of the difference in the 8-man and the 11-man football.
Right.
And so that's what I think some people forget. It's very difficult to find something that geographically makes sense and logically makes sense, and I'm not entirely convinced that mine did, but I did like it because it allowed the state to create large leagues again. Mm-hmm. And this is why I'm hedging, because even at the 6A classification, I know there's been a lot said about this newest proposal. There's only 32 teams in the 5A, and that's just a ridiculously low number of teams. And I suppose that's true, but if you can find a way to create leagues of a large enough size where you can re-emphasize league play, that's the thing to me that's been missing in the reclassification, is league play isn't as important anymore. And there really, every year, only, no matter what the sport is, there's only a few teams that realistically come into the season thinking that they can win a state title. And their fan bases know it. But if you create a situation where winning that league title is so important and is valued again, then you have more fan bases who come into the season with something to honestly play for at the end of the year. And that would be the thing I would look for, because it gets more competition, and I think it gets fan bases back into this regular season. Whereas now, with the 5A, it feels like everybody's playing out the strings so that the top 7 teams can all get a shot at Sherwood and see which one of them, if anybody, and honestly this year I don't think anybody can take them down.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that interesting perspective. Appreciate that.
Well, and sorry to interrupt, but I mean, where it comes here is, I think that it's ridiculous that the PIL only realized now that they are part of a reclassification process, and now they've decided they all want to be all together. They've had 14 months to make this decision, and things wouldn't be nearly as complicated and hurried as it's going to be here over these last month to make this reclassification work now for the committee that didn't work for a year plus. But at the same time, them saying, look, we want to reemphasize the city's titles and league titles, and postseason play at the state level isn't quite as important for us. I can get on board with that, I guess, with what I'm saying about emphasizing league play. I just think that coming in at the 11th hour and saying we want to do this is really unfair and short-sighted by them because of the challenges it creates for everybody else.
I agree with that. The PIL has had plenty of time to look at this, and in fact, I think the OSA has been talking about this reclassification since the prior time ended. So the last 2-3 years easy, but they really have their hands full in the next month to get this sorted out, because people's schools and their administrators' opinions are changing and so forth, because now it's getting down to crunch time.
Well, and what happened was when the PIO made their move, it took so many teams out of the 5A that the committee saw that as an opportunity, and Craig Walker-Bend, the athletic director and former longtime football coach, who's part of of this process saw that as an opportunity again to try to put the Intermountain Conference back together, something he's been very open and honest about wanting to do. The problem is, up here on the river, the feeling of going back into a league where you've got to travel 5 to 6 hours for league contests is just not something that they're willing to do anymore. And they shouldn't have to do it either. Highway 97 is not Interstate 5. It's not Interstate 84. It's at times a dangerous roadway to travel on, especially during the winter months. And they're just not interested in going back into it. But in the latest proposal, the IMC's recreated to get that 8 or 9 team league back together. And I think what you're going to see is 2 teams in the Columbia River Conference, the Dalles and Pendleton, are for it, or maybe in the Dalles case, indifferent. And Hermiston and Hood River Valley just aren't ready to go back down that road again. Hood River staunchly against it. It's why they were willing to play up to 6A back in 2006. And Hermiston, they've been very adamant about this. They're not traveling down to Central Oregon all the time for conference play again. It's a $20,000 hardship on their athletic budget.
Yeah, okay. Well, I appreciate that perspective. And that kind of leads me to my next question for you, Eric, and this will be our last question before we cut you loose. You're listening to Prep Talk on LaneCountySportsOnline.com. We have Erick Olsen on the phone here, is the voice of the Hermiston Bulldogs. Last question here for you, Eric, and that leads into what you were kind of talking about before regarding media coverage and perspectives of Eastern Oregon. Do you feel that that's balanced and across the rest of the state? And if not, what can be done to improve that?
Oh, no, I mean, people aren't as aware about this team, and, that's, or even, the eastern side of the state. It's more of a very localized thing. So in the Portland area, if a team has played, let's say, at the 2A level, Portland Christian, right there in the heart of Portland, they've played Stanfield's Tigers a bunch of times in a bunch of sports in the postseason. So they're not going to be surprised if they see Stanfield, who put up 74 points last week, in the playoffs. They'll know what they're getting. But overall, people don't know what that team can do. And it's really challenging because being from a media background and being in a media field, it does take numbers to make sure you're covering as many games as possible and getting detailed coverage of as many teams as possible. And so to get that out to a state level is a difficult task. And, if there's enough interest to it, it would drive more coverage. But it's all a numbers game, and not just in people, but in whether or not the interest is there from, financial backers too.